Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in this video we're going to be talking about the problem of evil. The problem of evil is the biggest argument against God's existence. It goes beyond just, I've given you in other videos arguments in favor of God's existence. And then sometimes you'll get atheists who will object to those arguments and say you haven't proved that God exists. But the problem of evil goes beyond that. Instead of just saying you haven't proven it, the problem of evil says actually God doesn't exist, or you are irrational for believing in God. You should not believe in God. So the problem of evil is like the biggie. It is the big anti-God argument. It is the argument against God's existence. And as Christians, since we believe in the Christian God, it is an argument against our God, and it is an argument against really all of the major world religions are going to run into problems. And we'll see as this video goes on that the problem of evil is actually functions as an argument against atheism, against Hinduism, Buddhism really, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. Like those are the big ones, and it's a problem for everything. Everybody has to deal with the problem of evil, but certainly for people who believe in a supreme God, the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this is the biggie. This is the big argument on the other side. This is the big one that says, no. God doesn't exist, and you shouldn't believe in God, or you're irrational for believing in God, or that sort of thing. Now, oftentimes what's interesting to me is how rare the problem of evil is raised when interacting with secular atheists. It's amazing that they don't bring it up more. And it does make me wonder if they don't know about it. Which, if you're an atheist, you need to have the problem of evil as one of your benchmark arguing points to bring up. It's an important point that you should bring up. And it's kind of crazy not to bring up your biggest gun, What's more common, my experience with atheists a lot of times is it seems like, well, take that back. Not all atheists. But certain ones have a tendency to, it's like they became an atheist when they were 12 and they never looked back. They never studied anything. And so their ideas about God are the same ones that they had when they were 12. And so to refute those ideas is like refuting the ideas of a 12-year-old. Now, thankfully, that's not all atheists. There are atheists out there who put more effort and intellectual rigor into, their point of view. And the problem of evil is the result of that. Now, the problem of evil, there's more than one way to say it. And there's a Russian author by the name of Dostoevsky who is famously had it in his book, The Brothers Karamazov. And Karamazov and he had, there's you reveal, I don't want to reveal the ending of the book if you're reading it or going to read it, but one of the brothers is having a conversation with Alyosha, the other brother. I can't remember all the brothers' names. Anyway, one of the brothers gives this explanation of the problem of evil, and it's really good. I'm not going to give this great poetic explanation. I'm going to give you more of a bare-bone philosophical approach. But essentially, the problem of evil works like this. A perfectly good, benevolent God, in other words, a God who wants what's best for us, for others, who wants the best for others, which would be us, and all other beings other than God. So you could say omnibenevolent, a God that like has the maximum benevolence. Okay, and benevolence just means like love, like wanting what's best for others. You've got that, and then you've got an all-knowing and all-powerful God, omniscient and omnipotent. Then the question is, how can evil exist? So if evil exists, God can't exist, or you have to define God in a different way. You have to say that like there's no way. The way the argument's framed is like you can't have it all. You have to you have to drop one of these. You can't have all of them. And we're going to break down how that works, I guess, sort of by looking at. We'll start by looking at sort of the history of this. So, and as we dig into this and making a Christian response to this, and there's way more study we could put into this. One of the problems is like you'll have a bare bones, simple explanation of the problem of evil, like I've just stated it, and you'll get a lot of, as Monty Python would say, the atheist on the street and the Christian on the street having a conversation about this, and they fail to realize that there's been tremendous progress and change and movement on this question. The Christians were pushing a particular position literally for centuries. They gave it up and then took a different approach, and now the atheists have conceded ground since the 1970s. And so, by atheists and Christian, I mean the philosophers who literally dedicate their careers to studying and arguing back and forth about this in journal articles. And I hate to break it to you, but the atheist on the street and the Christian on the street probably hasn't, really put the time into studying this. It's not that you can't understand it. It's just that you worry about other things. It's not your job. Literally, there are atheists out there and there are Christians out there who it is literally their job. They literally dedicate their professional careers as professors, as philosophy professors, to writing journal articles back and forth at each other, arguing this stuff. And so let's just go through the history of like the real back and forth debate on this. So, what is the earliest, attempt to deal with this? The earliest presentation of the problem. Probably, it's in the Bible, in the book of Job. The book of Job seems to be a book of the Bible that really deals with nothing else but a lot of thought and a lot of reasoning and a lot of questioning and a lot of debate and just a whole lot that deals with the problem of evil. Now, I used to think that Job was probably the oldest book in the Bible, but I've now learned that that's actually something that I was taught that was wrong. And you go to actual experts who study this stuff, and they're like, oh no. The reasoning I was told was just it's in the first part of Job, all these bad things happen to Job, and it says these people here attacked all of his camel herders and all of his sheep herders, and it says the names of the people groups. And the reasoning was that I was told was those people groups, lived a really long time ago. But now, from what I saw on Wikipedia and what I've heard from Christian sources like Michael Heiser is no, those people groups existed much, much later. So we're looking at a window of about 600 to 300 BC is the best estimate for when Job was written. And conservative Christian writers are yeah, we can't put Job way, way back. The case that the strongest evidence for an early book, and what's probably the earliest book in the Bible in terms of composition, in terms of the evidence, from what I've seen from people who study this stuff, is Exodus. Exodus is the oldest in terms of when it was written. Obviously, Genesis, goes back further in time and talks about the creation, the first moment of creation. But then so does John chapter 1, and you would never think that John chapter 1 is the oldest book of the Bible. So anyway, Job, talks about this. We'll get into what Job says, because I think the answers that Job gives to this, and some of the biblical points, are still relevant for us today. But the next big person on our list is this guy he's a Greek philosopher named Epicurus. And to give, basically the middle of his life is around 300 BC. So before and after that. We'll just say 300 BC for Epicurus. We don't know for sure, but there is evidence to say that he was probably the first person to ever put the problem of evil out there. He didn't put it out there in the language that I gave it to you just now, but it was something along those lines. And that would have been 600 years later, around the time of Constantine, the Roman emperor, the Christian Roman emperor, around 300 AD. Okay, and just a little bit about Epicurus, because he's kind of an interesting guy and he has a lot of relevance. Although he was a man of his time and dealing with issues of his time, and there's been a lot in recent years where people try to, in more modern philosophy, like in the 1700s and stuff, people try to borrow Epicurus, and even Karl Marx wrote his doctoral thesis on Epicurus. People and these atheists that live in the 1700s, the Enlightenment guys, they try to borrow ideas from Epicurus, and one of them was this problem of evil. David Hume is a philosopher in the 1700s who did exactly that, and he gave this very straightforward explanation of the problem of evil. But there's a little bit of confusion, because Epicurus, people try to make him their guy who said what they are saying today, and they have a guy who said it a long time ago, and it's not really fair, because Epicurus' big thing was he rejected Platonism, and Platonism was a thing that was big. He was an Athenian. He was from Athens, which is also the city of Plato and Socrates, and he rejected Platonism, and he was an empiricist. So he said that the only reliable source of knowledge was not pure reason or reasoning, but just empirical observations like sight, hearing, sound, touch, etc. And so, people come along later in the 1700s and 1800s, and they push that same idea. And they're empiricists. You have Christians who are going down that road. And it becomes this thing for the first half of the 20th century, from 1900 to 1950, called Verificationism. And by that point, you had different people saying it in the 17 and 1800s, and they're piggybacking off Epicurus and say, oh, he said it too. And they make a case for it, and then by 1900, it's the dominant view. Like Albert Einstein, everybody, is a verificationist or an empiricist, and they think that's the only source of knowledge. And then in the 1950s, it gets refuted. And so you have this, what some have called the most important event in 20th century philosophy, was the defeat of verificationism in the 1950s. And you have a lot of people, like when you're talking to the atheist on the street and the Christian on the street, or if they're in the university but they're not in the philosophy departments, a lot of times their understanding of philosophy does not their understanding has no knowledge of what happened. It's all pre-1950. They don't understand that verificationism has been defeated. They don't understand that atheists have basically conceded ground on the problem of evil once Christians in the 1970s took a different approach. But a lot of this stuff goes back to Epicurus, or guys in the 1800s wanting to make Epicurus their guy, like Karl Marx in the 1840s. Okay. So anyway, Epicurus was an empiricist, but the thing is, Plato and Platonism, and Plato, you have to understand Platonism to kind of get it. Plato thought that like everything we see is a fake version of the real thing that exists in this Platonic world of Platonic forms. And like if you sit, his classic example is the example of the chair, and like every chair is an imperfect chair, and we can conceive in our mind a perfect chair, and we can conceive it purely in our mind. So the world that we conceive in our mind, mentally, philosophically, is where that's the more real world, and this world is the fake, wannabe copy world. And like if you have an original handwritten document and then you make photocopies and photocopies and photocopies, but they all come back from that original and they're all slightly off. That's kind of what Plato was hitting at, and you can only access that world like you could, like Plato's point is like you can never draw a perfect circle, but you can conceive of one mathematically through mathematical equations. What really defines a perfect circle, So Plato absolutely believed numbers exist, logical truths exist, that kind of thing. Platonically, as we say, he had this idea of Platonic love, where it was like this homosexual relationship that was more in tune with the ideas. So you probably heard that, people still say that phrase today. It's a Platonic relationship, and like today we just mean that it's not romantic. It's just purely there's nothing physical. There's no physical romance going on. But that's not what Plato meant. Plato just meant that for the older person, the more important part was the mental part. So, Epicurus was not an atheist. So that is one point I think we need to make about this, is although he probably put forth the problem of evil, Epicurus believed that the supreme God or the supreme gods were so supreme and so perfect that they cannot contemplate anything other than their own perfection. So you could say Plato was a monotheist, or you could say he was a polytheist, but like, since the gods would be so transcendent and perfect that they can't contemplate anything but their own perfection, then they might as well be one God, But in Epicurus's view, we should ignore them because they can't possibly contemplate us. So he wasn't an atheist, but like for him, the problem of evil would just simply demonstrate that God is not all loving. God is so perfect that God can't possibly think about us ants down here. So that is, the Epicurean idea on God. Like, it's a little bit weird because we now recognize that like verificationism and this extreme empiricism is self-contradictory, and someone like Karl Marx, for example, didn't recognize it. So like but it's self-contradictory because if you say the only thing I can trust is empirical observations, well, how do you know that, right? How do you know that you can trust empirical observations? You're basing that on pure reason. I don't know. There's a lot of what Epicurus wrote is lost to us, so he may not have been, this full-blown verificationist and committing this like logical contradiction. But someone like Karl Marx in the 1840s absolutely, described Epicurus that way and held him up as this great empiricist of ancient times, and so he's become like the poster child for like a lot of modern atheist ideas in a lot of ways, because he had a lot of that in there, but he actually did believe in God, so but yeah, I don't know that he was such an extreme empiricist as someone in the 17 or 1800s like Karl Marx would have described him as, would have assigned that to him, because there was like an extreme, like, in his day, you had Platonism, which said that the physical world is the fake world and the only real world is the mental world. And so he may have just been rebelling against that and pushing back against that, which I think we all would want to give him a round of applause for that, because like it's clear that we can make mental mistakes, and sometimes as in engineering, you're always told build a model, a physical model, to test whether or not your design works. As you make mental mistakes. But the Greeks really had a problem with that, and that's a whole point of conflict that came up with the creation of science. But eventually, so I don't know that he was this extreme verificationist. He may have just been pushing back against this extreme Platonic forms reasoning thing. He also was strongly opposed to the skeptics of his day. And that's one point. The skepticism is this idea that we can't know anything, and then it's also self-contradictory. Like, how can you know that? But someone like Karl Marx flat out saw the one contradiction and said, oh, Epicurus would never be a skeptic because that's self-contradictory. He would be an empiricist and avoid this. It's actually also fundamentally self-contradictory to have this strong form of empiricism, which is what verificationism is. So he also had this idea. So there's this guy who came before him named Democritus who proposed this idea of what's called atoms. And Democritus thought that like everything in the universe, the world, the gods, everything were composed of these little particles that he called atoms. And we use that today for something else, but it's mostly because we were looking for the particles that that Epicurus and Democritus believed in. Epicurus disagreed with Democritus because Democritus thought there was no free will because the atoms move and there's pure causation. But Epicurus said that like there's this process called the swerve where the atoms can do things that like undeterministically, I can't go into that, but he basically said free will could exist, even though through this process he called evolution, if I remember right, he called it evolution, that the physical particles gave rise to all living things. But through this process called the swerve that he described, which is where things don't follow like a set, like scientific law of causation. Speaking of causation, Epicurus adamantly made it clear, we know this, that he believed that only nothing comes from nothing. So he would have strongly agreed in the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. And the thing is, like, well, how do you know that? Well, the Epicureans like to, when there was something that like you couldn't see, they would use an example of something you could see as a way to like conceive of like how do you know only nothing comes from nothing? Well, it's a philosophical idea. It's really philosophically proven. But what the Epicureans would do is like they would use examples in everyday life and then like build theories on starting with those examples. That's not really verificationism, that's still using reasoning is still at the table. So I still think Epicurus might have just been opposed to the extreme, other end of Platonism. the key thing, or one more key thing for us to remember about Epicurus, because the Epicureans actually show up in the Bible. We have Paul giving a sermon to them. There was major conflict in the Roman and Greek world over the moral teachings of Epicurus. Epicurus, his moral teaching was basically pleasure good, suffering bad. So, and again, the Romans embraced Stoicism, and it was a different philosophy, but like they had this idea of Roman virtue, especially manly virtue, because in the Greek and Roman world, the idea that you would be attracted to women meant that there was something wrong with you. You were supposed to pursue the higher ideals, and so Epicurus, went the other way, and he said, if it brings you pleasure, it's good, and if it brings you suffering, it's bad. So a famous Epicurean quote is "Carpe diem," or "Pluck the day," or "Seize the day." Okay. But so he didn't have this idea of like following some sort of moral virtue or some sort of moral duty, regardless of whether or not it brought you pleasure. That he didn't have that, and so that was a major point of conflict. I know we're taking a long time with the history stuff, but it'll all make sense as we go, because it's kind of important for us to know where this comes from, and it'll actually help us unpack the question. So